At the end of World War II, huge parts of Europe and Asia are in ruins. Borders of countries have to be redrawn. People, soldiers, supplies have to go home. When the war began, the world's population was about 2 billion. In less than a decade, 80 million people will have died. 60 as a direct result of the war, and the other 20 as a result of the famines and other environmental costs of the war. World War II is a big deal. There's a reason it occupies so much of our collective conscious. The reason that everyone is kind of obsessed with it. The reason why my dad, Miss Sinclair's dad, probably your dad, could watch it on the History Channel all day long. It changes the world. But how? The first thing that I want to talk about is the material cost of the war. I mentioned already that Europe and Asia are in ruins. This is Berlin. This is what it looked like. Right? A capital city of Europe, the capital city of the Germans, reduced to ruin. Most of northern France, reduced to ruin. Most of Germany, reduced to ruin. Most of Russia, well, the western part, reduced to ruin. Imagine not only the material cost of this, but the cost in reconstruction, the cost in livelihoods, the cost in normalcy. We're going through a period of our lives right now where our normal has been completely changed. And that's just sitting at home and watching Netflix, right? That's not a war destroying everything that we've known. The other thing that I want to talk about, and then we're going to keep talking about, is the human cost. So this is something that's often overlooked, but millions of people are displaced by the war. Think of people who are fleeing from the actual battles, actually. Think of people who are prisoners of war. They have to go home. They have to find their regiments. They have to find their people. Think about the survivors of the concentration camps. They literally have no record of where their family is or if any of them are still alive. And then a group who often gets overlooked is the 12 to 14 million Germans who had moved into those lands that Hitler annexed. People who were put on trains, just not nearly as severe actually, but as people who were being shipped to concentration camps, but people who were made to go settle, quote unquote, land that was supposed to be German. 12 to 14 million of them in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in Ukraine, in Denmark. These people all have to go home too. And it's estimated that up to 2 million of them died in the process because of the starvation, because they were captured by Soviet troops, because of the hardships. Millions of people are displaced. One of the other major effects of the war is the development of this idea of war crimes. Right, so we had kind of had this in the Geneva Convention of 1907, but it hadn't really been enforced. However, after World War II, in Europe are held the Nuremberg trials, where war criminals, major Nazi officials, major Italian collaborators, French collaborators, Czech collaborators, Austrian collaborators, Hungarian collaborators with the Nazis are all put on trial. Thousands of people are executed, and thousands of people are sentenced to massive prison sentences. The Nuremberg trials are a massive illustration of the justice, the victor's justice that is exacted on the Axis powers. Furthermore, there's also one in the Pacific where Japanese generals and soldiers are put on trial. So, this is the burning of the last part of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. The British, you can see their flag here, they don't want any evidence left there, right? They were so traumatized by what they found that they burn it to the ground. And this happens in 1946, so 1 year after the war is over. General Eisenhower, who later becomes president of the United States, also travels to concentration camps. He wants to see it for himself. He knows that he's of a certain status in the United States, and he wants to be sure that he sees it so that he can be a living record. So that when he goes back to the United States, that he can say, no, this was real. This is what happened. This forever changes the idea of genocide, right? The idea of genocide had not really been put into place where a state can systematically pursue and destroy a particular group of people. But this happens when the UN is created, and the UN comes up with a convention on genocide. And a Scandinavian man is actually he's responsible for pursuing this, and he gets it to be acknowledged as to what happened. So, speaking of material and human costs, this is Hiroshima. 1 year after the atomic bomb is dropped. It's completely leveled. It's completely abandoned. The people who survived the atomic weapon, where did they go? What did they do? Right? It said that 100,000 people die in Hiroshima when the bombs dropped. And we're going to talk more this week about civilians as casualties. But think about that. Think about also the way that the atomic bomb and atomic weaponry alter the entire course of human existence. Never before could one person, the President of the United States or the Premier of the Soviet Union, kill 100,000 people or more as the hydrogen bomb is developed in the 50s with the press of a button. Think of the consequences of that. How much power can be put into one person? This is a new idea. This has never happened before in human history. I wanted to contrast the leveled and destroyed Hiroshima with what Americans come back to, right? We think of the end of the 40s and the 50s and the 60s as this era of prosperity, of the baby boom, of the GI Bill. And this is Levittown, Pennsylvania. And it's one of the first suburbs, and you can see all the little cookie cutter, right? You probably heard of little boxes, right? So Americans come back to prosperity, and the Japanese have this. So think of the contrast there, right? That what are the spoils of victory? And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about is the technology, right? So here, this is ENIAC. This is the first major computer. We also have radar becoming highly used during the war, and then kind of growing from there, right? Antibiotics take off during World War II. World War I didn't really have antibiotics. So, right, if you got gangrene, you died. If you got blood poisoning from your wound from hanging out in a trench, you died. But antibiotics play a huge role in the war and afterwards. So World War II is hugely impactful. And we're going to talk about some major developments that come from it, some major effects. The first we're going to talk about is how the government control people. That's not something that I've talked about yet here, but a total war, like the type of war that World War II was, this idea of war taking over an entire society, think of how much more control that gives the government over the people when they can ration the food you eat. They can tell you what you can and can't buy. They can tell you what you can and cannot watch on TV or listen to on the radio. All of these things impact the way that people see the government. So if you start with the New Deal and the way that the government kind of became more involved in the economy that way, then think about World War, it comes right after that. World War II comes after that. So how does that impact the role of the government in society, right? So we're going to look at propaganda. Then we're going to look at civilians and the role that civilians play as military targets. And then we're going to look at the Holocaust. And that's going to be how we end the week, definitely on a downer. But these things are important and they change the course of history. And that's why we're going to study them.